Hello, and welcome back to France Made Simple, the podcast where I demystify life in France and debunk some of the many myths that surround living here. So, today we're talking about the true cost of living in France, which is something that comes up again and again. People always ask me about this. So, people often want to move to France because of the sort of general reputation of incredible food, long lunches, a slower, more civilized lifestyle. And you can absolutely have that lifestyle and live well in France, but only if you understand where your money is actually going to go and, you know, realize how much you're going to have to spend and see if that's going to work for you. Because the cost of living here isn't just about how much you spend. The system's structured differently, and I think that's where people often get caught out. So in this episode, I'm going to try and break down the true cost of living in France, from the obvious expenses to the sort of more hidden ones that might quietly but effectively drain your budget. So let's start with the basics and the most obvious costs. So first of all, housing. Now, obviously, if you're looking to live in a big city, or, perhaps you've already stayed in Paris or Aix-en-Provence or somewhere like that, you already know it's expensive. Rents are high, space is very limited, and you're going to have to compromise on something, whether that's size, location, the amount of light in your apartment, etc. But I have to say, I think the majority of people that move to France are looking to move outside of major cities, and there prices drop very fast. In rural areas, you can still find property that seems unbelievably cheap. Then there's food. Now, food and groceries in France are actually quite reasonable, especially if you shop locally. I think they're more expensive than the UK, probably less expensive than the USA. Markets, if you go to markets, you eat seasonal produce, you get good quality basics, you can eat very well without spending too much. But eating out can add up quickly, and there are cheap and simple menus still available in France for as little as 9 or 12 euros. But if you do it regularly and want to do it regularly, then that's going to be an extra cost. Now, then transport. So public transport's efficient and relatively cheap, but outside of the big cities, you're probably almost certainly going to need a car. And then your costs are going to start mounting up. You've got fuel costs, and okay, at the moment, they're all going through the roof, but hopefully that won't last forever. You've got tolls on the motorway, vehicle maintenance, and, people earn decent money in France. So even a mechanic in a garage will earn a decent salary. So that means that maintaining your car is going to be a certain amount of money. But then we get on to the hidden costs. And I think this is where things are much more difficult for people to calculate before they get here. Because I think the real financial pressure in France comes from the sort of the hidden or almost irregular one-off costs, although obviously some of them are very regular. So let's start with taxes and social charges. Now, if you're employed, this is going to be handled for you, or most of it anyway. You just end up with your money at the end of the month. But if you're self-employed or running a business, it's a completely different story. Social charges can take a significant percentage of your income. And if you're not an entrepreneur, they can be unpredictable in terms of not when they're requested. It was going to be tri-monthly or at the end of the year, but it's certainly the amounts. Then we've got utilities. Electricity is a big cost in France, and if you're renting, older homes are often poorly insulated. Laws have changed, and only properties with a certain energy rating are now able to be rented officially on the open market. But having said that, there are still properties available that people will rent out of desperation that do not conform, and heating them can be absolutely astronomical. Equally, if you buy a property and unless you can attack the thermal part of the renovation instantly, your heating costs are going to be quite high. Then you've got water, waste collection charges, local council taxes, and they all add up. And they're often billed in ways that don't kind of align with a monthly budget. Most of those bills come in towards the end of the year, and November can be a pretty horrendous month for everybody. Then you've got insurance. You need home insurance. This is obligatory in France, assurance habitation. The same with car insurance, obviously. And if you want full coverage, especially for property insurance, it's not particularly cheap anymore. Then you've got banking costs. Now, French banks still have a culture of account fees, card charges, random transaction charges. It's just unbelievable. There's always a frais de dossier, a frais de something. None of these are kind of insurmountable or particularly shocking, but if you don't anticipate all of this, it can kind of cause what I would call maybe financial friction, that sort of sense of constantly being, oh my God, there's more money coming out of my account. I hadn't counted on that. I hadn't worked out that was going to be charged this month as well. Then we've got healthcare. Now, France has got one of the best healthcare systems in the world, but it's not entirely free. It works on being refunded, and you pay the upfront costs. Although, if you are in the system with a carte vitale, then you will not pay the 70% that the state reimburses upfront. Almost always these days. It didn't used to be the case. But if you want full coverage or close to it, you need a top-up insurance policy, a mutuelle, which we talked about in the last episode. So that's another monthly or annual cost. And depending on your age and level of cover, it can be quite significant. If you want full coverage and you're in your sort of 40s, 50s, and you want, decent amount of coverage for going to the dentist, getting spectacles, you're talking around 100 plus euros a month per adult. And then there's the cash flow element. I mean, even if you're going to get the money back, you still need to pay it up front. And specialists can charge more than the standard rates, and some areas do have long waiting times. So yes, healthcare is entirely accessible and it's of an incredibly high quality, but financially it's not always as simple as people assume. We're going to talk more about healthcare and different kind of criterias for whether you're a retiree with an S1 or whether you've got what they call an ALD, an affliction of longue durée. So something like, cancer or diabetes in another episode, because then different things apply. But, the basic line here is that a large proportion of your healthcare is funded by the French state. You will need to meet those costs, sometimes upfront if it's, for example, the dentist and you're having, implants done, and then your mutuelle may or may not pay the rest of the charge. Now, then we get onto property, and I think this is where a lot of people miscalculate just how much it's actually going to cost them. Because people say, oh, we bought a house in France for the price of a small apartment back home, and we swapped our 3-bedroom semi in Bracknell for a manoir with 4 hectares of land. And that's true. The actual purchase price is one thing, but you've got to remember the other costs. Then first of all, there are the notaire fees. These are around 10%. So that's quite a substantial upfront cost, a lot more than many buyers expect. There may be agency fees. And then you've got the ongoing taxes. So taxe foncière is annual. Again, it comes in November. So my advice there is pay it monthly so you don't get a huge bill in November along with every other huge bill. And it is charged on the size of your property and what the property has. So, for example, if you have a swimming pool, you'll pay more than somebody that doesn't have a pool, etc., etc. And in some cases, you may have to pay taxe de habitation as well. Then you've got maintenance costs. Older French properties require almost ongoing work, whether it's roofing, heating systems, insulation, structural repairs, just general wear and tear. It all adds up. And renovations in France are very rarely quick or cheap. And if they are cheap, they're probably going to be shoddily done. So beware the artisan that can turn up on Monday and do you a quick job for cash and it seems half the price of everybody else, because it's probably not going to be that much of a bargain. So whilst properties can be a bargain, you've got to factor in the long-term financial commitment. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. That manoir with 4 hectares, well, it's going to have a fairly decent sized roof that's going to require maintenance, even if it's in relatively good nick when you buy it. And those 4 hectares of land are going to require mowing, strimming, maintaining, fencing, you name it, all adds up. Now, then we get on to lifestyle. And I think there is a sort of a reality that your spending habits will change when you move to France. People tend to consume differently in France. You might eat out less, but you might cook more and better. You might buy fewer things and invest more in quality. And this is all, I think, comes down to the fact that things take time in France and things are slightly less accessible and less instant than when you're used to perhaps in the Anglo-Saxon world. Shops close for lunch, services move slower, administration requires patience. So you end up making trade-offs, not just financially, but in terms of how you use your time. And that can be a massive positive thing, and that I think is why so many of us come to France, is to have more time. Now, one of the questions that people ask me quite often is, which kind of group of people, or who is it most difficult for to move to France and who struggles the most? And that's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, because all I can say to that is that financially, some groups do seem to feel the pressure more than others. I think freelancers and the self-employed, well, maybe that's because I'm one of them. I think it's hard for us because we have high social charges. We can't if you're an auto-entrepreneur, micro-entrepreneur, you cannot offset anything and your income can be quite variable. If you've got some regular clients and you have regular money coming in every month, then that's brilliant. But for lots of us, it can be very up and down, and that makes budgeting difficult. I think it can also be difficult for early retirees, especially if they haven't fully grasped how tax is going to work on foreign income. I think retirees who are on state pensions with limited means and, their income remains fixed, but the cost of living is going up, that's very tough for them as well. And I think also anybody assuming that France is just going to be cheaper to live in than where they came from is going to struggle, because it's not necessarily cheaper. It's just different. Some things are cheaper, some things are more expensive. And that, I think, the takeaway from this episode has got to be that France isn't cheap and it isn't expensive. It's different. It's a different system. And if you understand how that system works in terms of taxes, timing, the hidden costs that you might not have thought about initially, you can live very, very well here. But I think if you start your French journey with a sort of a monthly surface level view of expenses, you're probably going to run into problems, because there are always hidden costs and expenses, and there are always things that you haven't budgeted for. So you are going to need a sinking fund. You do need an emergency fund, says she who doesn't currently have one. But it is sensible to try and think about everything that your new life in France might entail in terms of outgoings before you launch yourself onto the adventure or roller coaster that is life in France. Now, I don't want this episode to come across as being negative or sort of off-putting to people who are thinking about making the move, because you can live extremely well in France, even on a limited budget. And there is a social security safety net that is quite exceptional. So if you are really struggling, there is help out there, but you just do need to be aware of all the possible cost implications before you make that move, just to make your life as smooth as possible. I mean, nothing is insurmountable in this world, but if you're constantly dreading opening your emails or opening your letters or your bank statements because you're just constantly worried about money, it does take a lot of the joy out of life. Believe me, somebody's been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. So just be aware of costs. Start thinking from the outset about every single aspect of your life. Budget for a worst case scenario and you will be fine. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful, informative, and possibly useful too. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping them my way. I love getting your questions and comments. It makes it all worthwhile. Thank you, as always, to our sponsors, Fab French Insurance, who will make your life in France as simple as Frenchly possible. And that is another thing to add there, that whilst you can get cheaper insurance policies, this again comes down to lifestyle, hassle, money. When you're looking for insurance, remember that the cheapest isn't always necessarily going to be the best, because if you do need to make a claim, having an English speaker on the end of the phone who will deal with all of that for you is worth its weight in gold. So when you're making those financial decisions about which manoir to buy, which car to import, which hedge trimmer to buy, think about how easy or difficult those purchases are going to make your life as well. Because at the end of the day, we all want to move to France to have a nice time and enjoy the long lunches, the sunshine, and the occasional glass of rosé. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.